So in the next section, I want to show you how you can secure the usage of your GitHub token. As we've seen before, the GitHub token can be used inside of an action workflow file. Here we see that we have a job that will be triggered when somebody creates a pull request. We have a triage job in here that will run Ubuntu. And we have a step in here that we'll use for an action from the marketplace that will label the pull request for us. We give it a repository token that it needs, and we're injecting here the secrets.github token. That token is a short-lived token that only has access to the repository that it is currently running in. And after the workflow has been executed, it will immediately be revoked and you cannot reuse it anymore. I want to show you how you can find the default values of this token, what you need to know about the context of which that token has been created in. And then I want to show you how you can lower the scope of your GitHub token so that you have given it less rights on your repository, for example. So let's go over that in a short demo. If I go to repository, you can go to settings, find the actions tab, and then drill down or scroll down into the workflow permissions. And you can see that by default, the GitHub token has read and write permissions to your entire repository for all the scopes that it has access to in the repository as well. So if you want to change the default, and that's of course much more secure, you can only give it read repository contents permission. Usually this is already enough if you only want to do the checkout action, for example, and from that build your actual source code. So using the GitHub token with this setup can never change any contents inside of your repository. The default one is already read and write permissions. Then you need to be aware of the context of which that token is being used in. If I, for example, go to my workflow file, and give it an example of we're using that as pull request. Currently, the pull request can be created from a public fork. Somebody forks over your public repository, adds some code to their setup, and then sends in a pull request. That will then be the context for the GitHub token in the pull request. And by default, to make sure that you're not just running arbitrary code inside of your workflow file that can do something inside your repository, all the pull requests coming from a fork will be handled as being sensitive, of course, having sensitive information. So the GitHub token will then only have read access into your repository. This also means that, for example, they cannot use your secrets value during the execution when you run it on a pull request event. If you really think it is safe to use, you can still give it more rights, and then you can use not to trigger pull request, but trigger it on pull request target. This will run on the target of the pull request. So it's already combining, for example, it with the destination branch, maybe your default branch. It has read and write access to your repository, and it even has read access onto your secrets. So in this workflow execution, you can actually use all your secrets. So be aware of the security limitations for this setup. Next up, I want to show you how you can lower the scope of what you have available in the GitHub token. You can do that either on the entire workflow level by adding permissions to the token. That's a keyword that has been added to the whole workflow. We can, for example, say I only want to have read access to the contents of my repository, but I also need to have write access for pull requests because I want to add a label, for example. So now we have scoped down what the GitHub token can do when it is being used inside of a workflow. You can also do that on the job level. So you have the first job, for example, that needs to have very strict permissions. It can only read, for example. In this case, I'm checking out my source code. For that, read would be sufficient. I can do that at the job level as well. So I need to make sure that the indentation is correct. This needs to go back. And now we have given it read access to only the context, and we can, for example, remove the write access. If you want to know more about the scopes that this has access to, you can go to the documentation page. I can share that link with you. For example, we see that for the permissions of the GitHub token, we see by default, if we give it permissive rights, the default one, then it has access to read and write to everything inside of your actions information. It can create checks and read those checks. We can read deployments. We can read issues, set up packages, and all that there is by the default access, which is pretty permissive. So if you down only specify it should be read-only, you can then only read your metadata and the contents of your repository. And then running that inside of the scope, as I said, by a fork repository that will always then have read access to everything. So with that, I think I give you an overview of the default values for the GitHub token, the context that you need to be aware that that GitHub token is being used. And I've shown you a way how to lower the scope for the GitHub token, either on the entire workflow level or on the job level itself.